Good evening and welcome to Hemispheres. I'm Richard Curtis. With me in the studio is Dr. Ira Chernus, Professor of Religious Studies, and Dr. David Brenner, Assistant Professor of German. We're going to be talking about how the American Jewish community impacts foreign policy, American foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy. I'd like to begin by reading a brief statement that was issued shortly after the most recent military action occurred, the Operation Grapes of Wrath. This statement comes from an ad hoc committee of Jews and Arabs, consisting mostly of journalists and intellectuals. From New York, April 18. A coalition of Arabs and Jews, all along active in promoting peace between Israel and its neighbors, are stunned by the silence of American Jewish leaders and their failure to condemn recent Israeli government actions. Israel is acting with the most cynical of purposes to demonstrate to the Israeli electorate that the Likud party is no less willing to injure, kill, and dislocate innocent Arabs than is Likud, said Laura Warnock of the International Jewish Peace Union, which has joined the ad hoc coalition. Once again, the Israeli government shows its flagrant disregard of international law. So the question before us this evening is, should leaders in the American Jewish community have responded differently? Ira?
Well, personally, I don't have any doubt that they should have responded differently, and I suppose we can go ahead and talk about why I hold that view. But perhaps an equally important or interesting question is why they did not respond differently, and why it is that now there can be an organized Jewish voice.
Let me interrupt just a moment. I need to make sure everyone's aware that we are listening to KGNU Boulder, 88.5 FM.
Now that we've satisfied the government, we can go ahead with serious business, right? So I think there are a series of related questions. How the American Jewish leaders should respond, but also how they did respond, and why it is that in 1996 there can be statements like this, which are issued by organized Jewish groups, and I understand some rabbis are associated with those groups, and how it has become more possible, though still very difficult, for institutional Jewish leaders to condemn Israel in any of its actions. That's something that 20 years ago was unheard of. 10 years ago was beginning to be heard of, but was a very small voice. I think that voice is gradually growing.
I noticed when you read the statement that you said Likud instead of Labor at a certain point, that the Labor Party is no less willing to injure, kill, and dislocate the Arabs than is Likud. I think Ira is on the mark. That
Excuse me if I might interrupt. Need to do with the full legal ID. This is KGNU Boulder, 88.5 FM with translator K260AC in Fort Collins, Colorado at 99.9 megahertz, and translator K229AC at 93.7 megahertz serving Ward and Nederland, Colorado. Sorry about that.
No, that's just a minor correction. I think this is also a common disposition in the American press as well as in the world press, if I may generalize, and this is a dangerous oversimplification, to read political motives into nearly everything. And certainly our political leaders in the United States and in Israel are watching CNN and concerned with reacting to the media on the minute. The only point I am making is certainly that Perez stands to garner some votes, most certainly, by this policy, and that is cynical. But the American Jewish leadership, as Ira rightly pointed out, is no less cynical, if I may use that word. Certainly there's more of a need for true leadership, for speaking the truth, or something close to the truth, and acting upon it. On the other hand, even before 10 years ago, there's a whole history of the American Jewish community's relationship to Israel and to American foreign policy on Israel. Even before 1967, and I was only 3 years old in 1967, I should add, there were certain tendencies, dispositions to, let's call it non-Zionism or anti-Zionism, even in Jewish communities. Things have changed. There's been historical change, and I think both of us as historians are very much aware that historical change is complex, but nonetheless it happens.
It might be worthwhile to follow up on that and give a bit of historical context to put our analysis of the present in some perspective. As David was saying, the kind of almost monolithic support of Israel and almost knee-jerk support of Israel that we've seen from Jewish leadership since 1967, it was not nearly so pervasive before the Six-Day War of 1967. That was really a radical turning point, and a lot of folks, especially younger people, are not aware of how much has changed in the American Jewish community, particularly during those 6 days of the Six-Day War. Because before that, it wasn't so much that there was a lot of criticism of Israel, although there was. Criticism of Israel was considered more legitimate before 67. But
Right.
it's more that there wasn't the kind of passion, there wasn't of supporting Israel, there wasn't the kind of sense that support for Israel was the sine qua non, the absolute foundation of Jewish life. And in 1967, in that Six-Day War, it was almost as if the American Jewish community found its true mission in life, or at least felt that way. And it was as if it had discovered all of a sudden that it had this intense, deep emotional bond with Israel. And so it's easily forgotten that that's a historical change, that's something that's relatively new on the American Jewish scene since 67.
Right, and in AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee didn't even exist, if I'm correct, before 1967.
It existed, but it didn't have nearly the clout that it had because it didn't have nearly the support from the American Jewish community that it had afterwards.
And even the program, the so-called charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, as we know it today, and as it was recently revised to take out the clause about destroying the existence of Israel, this particular charter was established in 1968 in the wake of the Six-Day War. There was certainly a charter as of already in 1964. But I think it's good that we have a little historical perspective about how the American Jewish community has changed, and what we were talking about before. One way I could summarize it is to say that attitudes have polarized, perhaps. Feelings are stronger, certainly. It was perhaps an issue of greater indifference before 1967.
Do you suppose it's because before the war, American Jews didn't feel that Israel was really threatened? Or was that just not an issue to them?
I think it was not nearly as much of an issue. However, I don't think that it's a matter of that, quote, objective threat arose and people all of a sudden saw it. I think it's more a matter of, because of internal processes within the American Jewish community, it was appealing to emphasize, I would say overemphasize, the sense of threat. I mean, nations frequently have conflicts with their neighbors, but the idea that Israel's very survival is threatened in an ongoing, permanent sense, that idea really emerged fully in the Six-Day War, and American Jews, by and large, found it such an appealing way to see the situation that they immediately latched on to that construction of the situation. There were other ways to see it in 1967. It was a very complicated situation as to what led up to that war. There were threats to Israel, but there were also all sorts of Cold War machinations going on, and it's not at all clear that in any objective sense the existence of Israel was threatened. But American Jews wanted to see it that way, chose to see it that way, found a tremendous sense of bonding with each other and a sense of a content, a meaning to Jewish life that had not existed before. And so that sense of Israel being threatened not only in June 1967, but being threatened perpetually became so fundamental to the way that American Jews saw Israel, saw our relation to Israel, and saw the world, really, that it's been a kind of a foundation of Jewish life ever since. Although, again, it's beginning to change. I think in a while we might want to get back to the more recent history.
Well, Ira asked at the outset, why does American Jewish leadership make the decisions and behave in the way that it does? I think we as academics tend to look at policy and policy implications. And even when I looked into the subject more in depth recently, at Northern Library there are at least two or three shelves of books on the Israeli-Arab conflict alone. Most of them are on the level of political history or political studies. No one talks about the cultural, psychological background. And to make it simple and to oversimplify again, American Jews, like other ethnic minority groups in the United States and elsewhere, have a visceral reaction to some of these topics, an emotional reaction. They feel defensive. So when you look at the polls, you see that American Jewry, having a strong liberal tradition, is very much in favor of Israel negotiating with the PLO since 1983. There's about 67% in favor of that. But when you ask the same people whether they trust the PLO, whether they trust the new Palestinian Authority, then they want to proceed with caution. So I think there's this visceral, and I'd like to call it the defensive mentality, that is behind some of this reaction. And whether the leaders themselves feel this way is worthy of investigation, but certainly they're reacting to that kind of reaction on the part of the Jewish American populace, which is documented in polls.
Let me follow that up. That data that goes back to the early 80s, the support for negotiating with the PLO, is a complicated issue because that's what American Jews would tell the pollsters when they came around.
Mm-hmm.
But if any American Jewish leader or American Jewish organization stood up and publicly said we should negotiate with the PLO until the secret Oslo negotiations were revealed just a few years ago, that was considered heresy.
Uh-huh.
So you have this curious situation where a majority of the people are willing to tell the pollsters they think negotiations are a good idea, but there's no organized support for that. There's no participation in the political process by American Jews to move the Jewish community in that direction. If there had been, then I think the United States government would have been much more open to that. But you know that until the Oslo agreements were revealed, it was considered absolutely taboo, not only by the Israeli government, but also by the American government. It was considered taboo to talk with the PLO, to even suggest it. Am I right that it was Andrew Young, who was ambassador to the UN under Carter,
Yes.
who was fired because he dared to have a conversation with a PLO permanent observer at the UN, right? And
Right.
that continued to be the case through the 1980s.
I mean, Amos Oz, the Israeli writer and intellectual, talks about how ridiculous it was in 1990, 1991 that the then Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, was having this long distance shuttle diplomacy with the PLO, whereas it would have just taken a shorter distance telephone call to take care of these matters. So there are delicate political themes. I wanted to add another reason for American Jewish defensiveness, and I think it is this perceived threatened situation in Israel, the perceived security threat to the state of Israel. And I think it, even on a personal psychological level, it plays a role in American Jewish reactions. The more the perceived threat, and this threat, as Iris pointed out, can be manipulated discursively, rhetorically, but the more this threat is perceived, the more perceived threat to American Jewry. And so if you look at the polls, and I realize polls are problematic, but even in the 1990s, when there is little evidence of massive formal anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish acts in the United States, there still is a huge fear that this could get out of control, that certain groups could become anti-Semitic, and that this positive situation for Jews, that is, the lack of anti-Semitism on a day-to-day, visible basis, that this could somehow change. And I think that defensiveness, for better or for worse, is a sort of part of the habitus, disposition, mental, emotional structure of American Jews.
Well, I don't hesitate to say that it's for worse.
It strikes me that that very phenomenon is in contradiction to long-term goals to alleviate the problem.
Mm-hmm.
If American Jews are supporting right-wing policies in Israel, then that seems to bring out the reaction on the part of the Lebanese or the Palestinians.
Well, no, I think we have to hasten to say that the kind of polling data that David was referring to shows us that the way the issue is constructed and discussed in the Jewish community, both here and in Israel, American Jews are not supporting right-wing positions. The majority of American Jews are supporting what are considered liberal positions. On the Jewish political spectrum, the majority of Jews are supporting liberal positions, which means essentially the present Labor Party position, a position of negotiating with the Palestinians, now with the PLO, of land for peace and that sort of thing. So we want to be careful with our language here.
Well, but I'm thinking in broader terms, that in terms of supporting Israel's occupation of territories won in 67 and 73.
Yeah, well, that's in a sense the irony of the thing is that as the American Jewish community became less monolithic during the 80s and into this decade, as there was a bit more diversity, and as David said, Jewish politics really polarized, right? That within the American Jewish community, you have a strong right wing in the Jewish sense, right wing group that is a group that supports Likud, and Orthodox Jews are more likely to be in that group, although they also get support across the Jewish spectrum. And at the same time, you've got this growing movement of a more labor-oriented, or more oriented toward the Labor Party's position, what's considered a more dovish position. See, it might be better to use the old Vietnam era words, hawkish and dovish. But what I want to say is that the irony is that from the perspective of what we might call a truly left-wing person, the Labor Party's, as the statement that you read at the opening of the show, the Labor Party's policies can be just as hawkish as the Likud parties have been. And so now you have this kind of liberal element within the Jewish community that is supporting the peace process, but ends up supporting certain activities like the recent terrible horrors in Lebanon, which we might very well consider really reactionary, really right-wing, but within the Jewish context, they're still considered liberals. They're valid. Their credentials as liberals are perfectly valid.
And if you're watching the coming Israeli elections at the end of this month, you will see that the true left-wing parties that were formerly part of the most recent coalition, like the Meretz party, are political non-players now. They, due to some of their own tactical mistakes, have been blocked out of the process. You will also see the Israeli Communist Party, which was about the only party that Israeli Arabs, that is, official citizens of the State of Israel, that was the only party that they were willing to support. I think if you look carefully at the Israeli Arab vote, you will see some defection from this party in the coming election. At least those are the indications. So this plays itself out in Israeli politics as well. The left is certainly in a crisis atmosphere. I guess it always has been. And what we should also stress is that the American Jewish community is a series of communities. It's a pluralistic, diverse group of individuals with diverse and differing discourses and opinions. So you have various contradictions, things that look like contradictions. You have this visceral defensive approach to the security of Israel and an overestimation of the threat of anti-Semitism to American Jewry, whereas you have a traditional liberal voting behavior, and indeed American liberalism, which is in contradiction to the basic upper middle class social formation of most American Jews.
And I guess since I'm a religious studies professor and Richard has a degree in religious studies, we probably ought to talk about religion here, a little bit at least, but it's directly relevant because in the American Jewish community, well, let's contrast that with the Israeli Jewish community, because for Israeli Jews, there's no need to construct their identity in religious terms. Right? Simply by living in Israel, being citizens of Israel, they are Jewish. And Jewish is a nationality, we might call it an ethnic as well as a political identity. In the American Jewish community, obviously, that doesn't work. Right? And so American Jews need to construct their identity as, by and large, as a religious identity, which makes American Jews feel, for the most part, that there ought to be some kind of moral component to their views on the state of Israel and their views on the conflicts that Israel gets into. And that's where a lot of American Jews get into a bind, because they're sincerely moral people. They're really good people. They don't think that killing is right, and they don't think that occupying other people's land and kicking them out of their homes, they don't think that's right. So it makes them feel uncomfortable, a lot of them. And these are the folks who will have told the pollsters, yes, we should negotiate with the PLO. But at the same time, because of that visceral defensiveness, because of that sense of threat, that fear for the survival of Israel that's been so deeply constructed in the cultural discourse of American Judaism, they will not act directly politically, or very few of them will act directly politically on their moral sensitivity. And so they end up being kind of tied up in knots and kind of politically paralyzed, I think, because of that. And when you do get very, very small numbers of organized Jews who are really left-wing, who really have a high moral sense of the justice of the Palestinian cause, those people are frozen out of the community discourse in the same way that, as David said, the really left-wing parties in Israel are being frozen out.
It would seem that Israeli politics are beginning to look more and more like ours, with two parties. One pretending to be liberal, one conservative.
And with now the direct election of the Prime
Right.
Minister for the first time.
That is an American sort of democratic move, and that is a first-time thing. I want to come back to this sort of double bind because I think it has another element. Jews in the United States have benefited from what historians refer to as American exceptionalism, which is a complex idea, but there are two aspects to it. The idea that this is an exceptional democratic society with opportunities for people that didn't have opportunities elsewhere, and a society that certain discourses in the society emphasize meritocracy. So you have a Jewish community that historically votes Democratic, the Democratic Party, second only to African Americans. You have this is the same community that votes and behaves liberally in terms of the political spectrum, but then they also believe in meritocracy because they've benefited from fairness and equal opportunity. And you have this strange behavior whereby I think most American Jews, that is at least most liberal, democratic identifying American Jews, would probably be in favor of some form of affirmative action. But there is a tension on the other side, particularly historically and particularly among the community leaders, against affirmative action, at least insofar as it maintains quotas. That's a sort of double bind, a dilemma that the American Jewish community finds itself in because it has benefited from being here. But on the other hand, there's tribal loyalty and there is the historical past of discrimination.
Well, I think this gets us to what I think may be at the heart of the American Jewish community's view of the world and its sense of identity, especially again since 1967. This is my own personal interpretation. I'm not an expert. I haven't done research and published in this area, but nevertheless, I'll just toss out my idea.
Me neither.
But I think if you go back to 1967, the experts who have written on this point out, it's a fairly obvious point, that when the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, the United States was in the midst of a great revival of ethnic identification and ethnic pride, led, I think, by the African American community, but also obviously the Latino community, the Native American community, the Asian American community, and all. For the first time in many years, it was becoming legitimate in some ways to assert one's ethnic identity, but those were constructed, for very good reasons, as identities of the oppressed. And we had this whole discourse being shaped in the late 60s of, in a sense, the world being divided into oppressors and oppressed. And as I say, my own kind of personal hunch on this is that there was an unconscious reflex in the American Jewish community when the war broke out in Israel in 67, which said, wow, we no longer have to be associated with the oppressors. Even though we are white, middle class, very well off socioeconomically compared to other oppressed groups, what would you rather be, the oppressor or the oppressed? And the American Jewish community had this opportunity to define itself as an oppressed group, right? And continues to do so, but then when we get into issues like affirmative action, it becomes, well, we are oppressed because affirmative action denies us opportunities that are opened up to other oppressed groups, and then we have the same sort of thing that we have with white males in general in this country, styling themselves oppressed groups, and we have the white male Anti-Defamation League or whatever.
And these are contradictions, and they are contradictions to be found in individuals, not just in communal organizations.
Well, it seems to me that, to get back to, I think, a point I was trying to make earlier, that contradiction, it would appear to me, brings out anti-Semitism by bringing out Arab hostility and providing excuses for the ordinary American right wing and its anti-Semitism, because the American Jewish community is identifying with the oppressor in terms of Israel and its relationship with poor Arab neighbors.
Well, but the important point in terms of American politics and the American media and perception, I should say U.S. American means the whole hemisphere, doesn't it?
Well.
Okay. In terms of no, I think it's an important usage.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of U.S. perceptions, it's only in recent years that Israel's begun to be perceived by any substantial number of people as the oppressor. And if you look at the coverage of the recent fighting in Lebanon, it's clear that still, by and large, in mainstream media, Israel gets the advantage, as it were, of being perceived as the oppressed, as being perceived as a kind of a passive victim. And I feel very strongly that that's really essential when the American Jewish community affirmed itself as an oppressed group beginning in '67. The sense of victimization that went along with that continues to the present day to a large extent and is reinforced by the media images that we get, you see. And so the Israelis come on and say, well, geez, if only those Hezbollah would stop sending those rockets over, oh, we'd love to live in peace with them. As if the Israelis themselves are not partners in an ongoing relationship, as if they simply have to kind of stand around and wait until somebody else does something. Because the sense of oppression, the sense of victimization always, I think, typically leads to a sense of passivity. And so in American perceptions, again, I don't think you can assume that there's any sense that Israel would be seen as the oppressor.
No, my point is that other people perceive Israel as the oppressor. That Arabs
Certainly on an
perceive,
international scale, yes.
and
Yeah.
and probably to a lesser extent here. Certainly, there are Arabs who
Mm-hmm.
are citizens of the United States or living in the United States, and others who would agree with their understanding of the role of Israeli occupation forces, that is the oppressor. And doesn't that identification with what seems to me is the objective oppressor, doesn't that support bring about its own problems?
I think this would require an analysis of minority and ethnic politics in the United States, looking at some of the Arab American associations, looking at some of the American Jewish associations and community organizations, and I'm not qualified to do so, but I'll tell you my hunch anyway. My hunch is that these organizations themselves have internal problems precisely because of these contradictions. But I have a certain hunch, and I could be wrong, that there's been a move towards less autocratic structures within the American Jewish community, that these contradictions are allowed to play themselves out, and more diversity is allowed on an organizational level. And I think the reason why 10 years ago, finally, we see some opposition towards Israeli policies regarding the Palestinians is precisely because a certain generation, that generation that came up in the 60s, the 68 generation, as we say in German, that this generation began to make inroads. Really an early part of the baby boomers, and Jewish baby boomers, start integrating into the Jewish communal leadership. And things change, however, very slowly, because it is hierarchical, although no more hierarchical than any other ethnic minority leadership or leaderships in the United States. That's my hunch. It has something to do with the leadership, which in turn determines how resources are allocated and how certain discourses and how the rhetoric is formulated.
Although, again, we also have to look at the impact of specific historical events, and in this case, the crucial event is the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which was much more massive and destructive than the recent invasion. As terrible as the events of the last few weeks were, what happened in '82 was just horrendous, far more horrendous, and especially, of course, the infamous massacres of the Palestinian refugee camps at Sabra and Shatila, which were not done by Israelis, but there's a general sense, I think, they were countenanced by the Israelis. And all this stuff was seen on television. And that galvanized an anti-war movement in Israel in 1982. The first really large-scale opposition to government policy. This is when the Likud was in power. And that legitimized, I think, the growing voice of the generation in the United States that was willing to start speaking out. But again, a very, very slow, painful process of opening up the Jewish community, which is even now a very slow, painful process, as we can attest from personal experience.
And I think the process of the new generation making its voice heard is something that came even more slowly in Israel. And you have this very curious reception, which we haven't mentioned yet, this reception of the Holocaust, particularly after 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, where one could make at least the rhetorical case that Israelis were the oppressed, at least for a moment there, although who caused the war is a chicken or egg question that I wouldn't want to approach. But certainly after 1973, you begin to see Israeli institutions, Israeli media, Israeli individuals dealing with the Holocaust, which there, like here, like most places on Earth, was pretty much ignored, repressed, you might say, until about this time. So, and then you have to look at the reception. Were the Jews in the Holocaust passive, or were they active, proactive resistors? Certainly this plays a role not only on individual psychological levels, but also in public policy making. And there's always the threat, I think, as Tom Segev has pointed out very nicely in a book called The Seventh Million, there's always the threat of Holocaust hanging over Israeli political discourse.
One of the texts that I always like to share with my students when we talk about the relationship between Israel and the Holocaust is a text that was cited by Emil Fackenheim, a very important Jewish theologian who makes the case for support of Israel as a religiously meaningful act. But he quotes an Israeli psychologist who fought during the '67 war and said that the Israeli psychologist uses the term a Holocaust psychosis. And that may be a bit extreme, but it kind of makes the point that the Israeli psychologist says that this, quote, Holocaust psychosis had spread throughout the entire Israeli Jewish community, especially among Israelis of Sephardic origin, Israelis from the Middle East and North Africa, who were not directly affected by the Nazi Holocaust, but it became a shared kind of experience. And during the '67 war, and even more strongly after the '73 war, became so fundamental again to the way that Jews in Israel and in the United States construct their identity. Because here again we can point out, many people are surprised to hear this, that, well, I would say before the '67 war, just as there was not all this great passion in the U.S. Jewish community for supporting Israel, there was very little discussion of the Holocaust, very little awareness of the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel's books didn't sell particularly well before 1967. So that the discovery of Israel as an endangered nation, the discovery of Israel as the symbol of an endangered Jewish survival, and the discovery of the intense attachment to the Holocaust, or the central meaning of the Holocaust for Jews, all are a package that have to be understood together.
And I think that this discourse in Israeli politics, where the Holocaust and Nazis keep reoccurring in parliamentary debates, and Segev shows this goes back to the beginnings, even before the establishment of the state. They go back to the Yeshuv, to the Jewish community in Palestine, pre-1947, 1948. I think in the United States, it's really only after 1973. We can argue if it's 67 or 73, but it's only after 1973 that the Holocaust becomes a sort of significant aspect in the construction of American Jewish identity, and that's something to consider.
Right.
I think that we're going to try and take a break right now and listen to a little Israeli music for just a few minutes. Hope that we can get this to work. And there we go. Ooh. And see what the people out there think. Hello, this is KGNU.
Interesting, and I think what's bothering me is several things. It's a very emotional issue. I think I've been pondering, for one thing, why is it so emotional? And I think, of course, number one is the Holocaust, and number two is it finally dawned on me after listening to you guys for half an hour that the reason I feel so concerned about what Israel does is probably that I want to ask a question, first of all, rather than just answer that, is do the two of you or the three of you think that Israel is, I could say a client state, but I don't think that's the right word. It's occurred to me more like a tutelary state of the United States of America. In other words, is Israel really under the protection of the United States of America? Would it exist without the United States of America, or could it exist in a crisis without the support of the United States of America? That is question number one. And if that happens to be true, that it is a tutelary state of the USA, then it seems rather logical that we as Americans would be very concerned about what it does, about the ethics of its policies and its activities. And I think this is sort of what I really wanted to focus on. If anybody there is interested, is if you could answer those two questions, because it seems to me the reason I feel pressured about the state of Israel is I'm thinking, well, it's not our creation. It's the creation of all the Jews who sacrificed to build it, but it is our sort of under our protection, and it's like a very strange situation internationally, if you ask me. So anyway, I hope you get the gist of my question. I'd be interested to hear what anybody has to say about it.
I'm glad you raised that, and perhaps that's the place where we should have started, is to point out that Israel is clearly economically and in some ways militarily very dependent on the United States, to the tune of officially, $3.5 billion a year, and some estimates of the total amount of U.S. taxpayers' money that ends up in Israeli hands goes as high as $6 billion. Nobody really knows how much it is. But anyway, every U.S. taxpayer has some sort of very practical interest in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and therefore in the relationship between the American Jewish community and the U.S. and Israel, because per capita we send so much more foreign aid to Israel than any other place. So that's certainly one reason to be interested. But I would suggest that the relationship is really two-way. Certainly the Israelis depend on us, as I said, economically, militarily, for all sorts of support. But at the same time, a lot of the money, I guess most of the money we send them in terms of military aid, is in a certain sense arming our hired hand, our hired gun, our cop on the beat in the Middle East. And if you go back to, I think it was 1969, when Nixon and Kissinger enunciated their doctrine that the U.S. would no longer be the policeman of the world, the corollary of that was that we would hire other nations to be our policemen in various regions. And in the Middle East, we needed two policemen because there's so much oil there, and the interest at stake are so high. So we hired the Iranians, who were at that time, of course, under the Shah, and the Israelis. The Iranians are no longer a very effective policemen for us, and so the Israelis are our key outpost, so that although they certainly depend on us, we depend on the Israelis in a geopolitical, strategic, and military sense.
Can I say something about that real quickly? There is, the Israelis are certainly very cognizant of this. Not only is there a universal draft in Israel, and everyone is serving continually in the reserves, at least males, and women are certainly also part of the military, if not in combat roles. There's certainly a sense in Israel that Israelis are constantly laying their lives on the line as perhaps the tutelary police of the United States, and which is one reason why in internal Israeli discourse, in Hebrew, in the press, you hear a lot of criticism of the United States, particularly the United States government, more than you might expect, and certainly more than we as Americans want to hear. Let me also add that I'm not sure of the Israeli governmental budget for the past couple of years, but it was somewhere around $36 billion, if I'm right, which would make about $6 billion, about 1/6 of that budget. Also, American Jewry is criticized in no uncertain terms by Israeli Jews, who seem to have little compunction, perhaps for this reason, the geopolitical role of Israel, and because American Jewry's contributions to the state of Israel are rather minimal, to the tune of about, if I'm correct, $200 million per year.
And I guess recently it's been declining.
It's been declining, which is less than 1% even of Israeli GNP.
Now, David, were you saying that there is discussion in Israel about the role of being a client state, and there are people who are actively talking about whether that's a good idea?
It's certainly, I think, an undercurrent of all discussions. It may be so assumed that it's not explicitly enunciated or articulated. I think certainly we see this in the press, particularly in the American press, on television. You see Shamir, you even see Rabin saying we won't necessarily always do what our ally, the United States, would like us to do militarily, economically. Certainly there was a small degree of resistance during the Gulf War. where
Yep.
where the American foreign policy was to enforce Israeli non-intervention in that conflict.
And it seems like there's not much need for the Israelis to toe the line, in many cases at least, and follow American dictates, because as we just saw recently on Peres's visit to Washington, whenever there's any sort of conflict that Israel's involved in, the outcome is always that the leader of Israel comes to the United States and gets a promise of more military aid. And whatever the latest weapons are, they're right in line to get them. And so that military pipeline keeps flowing, it seems, virtually no matter what the Israelis do. And therefore, there's not a whole lot of reason for the Israelis to have to toe the American line.
Well, thank you for your statements. It strikes me that it's. I guess, if I were an Israeli, I would be, I don't know, I can't say delighted, because I think to be an Israeli would be a very hard thing on the international stage, because partly what we've been talking about just now, there must be a great frustration in feeling somehow dependent on this monster, across the sea. It must be very frustrating. On the other hand, it's fascinating to me that in this country there is sort of this blind acceptance of Israel as sort of, the state which can do no harm, the almost a religious, dedication to Israel, based partly on Holocaust guilt, I would say, and that certainly is something that seems to be almost ineradicable right now. I guess I, as a sometime critic of Israel, would feel, well, if that's the position we're in, maybe we should be pulling a little more strings sometimes and influencing Israel's policies a little more directly. And I know from an Israeli viewpoint that would look like, interference from this strange being that they are tied to. It's a hard situation, but it's fascinating. So thank you for your comments.
And thank you.
Okay.
Let me add quick. We talked about how Israelis are instrumentalized as instruments of American foreign policy, and I think that consciousness is certainly there and comes out, I think, looking like a form of ingratitude. But American Jews are aware of this as well, which is reflected in what we refer to as their contradictory, double-bind mentality, as well as voting behavior.
Wouldn't it seem, given all of this support and the nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States, and particularly American Jews, that the government in Israel would see that it's in their interest to influence the way that American Jews think?
And they certainly do. They certainly attempt that. There's been a very close relationship between the Israeli government and the major Jewish organizations, I suppose, since the beginning of Israel. And it continues. When the Labor Party came into power, what was this, in 92? When Rabin came into power in 92, there was a big shakeup in the leadership of a lot of the major American Jewish organizations, because those organizations are, at the top level, politically aligned with either the Labor Party or the Likud Party. So if Likud wins again in a few weeks, we might expect to see that sort of shakeup again. But I'm not sure how much that touches the Jewish masses, if we can use that word, the average Jew on the street. I think those kinds of things get played out at fairly elite levels of leadership.
I think the Israeli factor, which political scientists call the X factor, is an important part of the construction of American Jewish identity. And if you know anything about the communal fundraising efforts, you know that not all of that money that is raised each year goes to Israel, but Israel is sort of the point guard, the factor that leads people into contributing, as it were. Certainly that's the appeal that it's made. It's called United Jewish Appeal.
Sure, because Israel represents that sense of threat, that fear that is so basic to the American Jewish community's self-identity, and one can always appeal on that basis to say, if you don't give more money, their Jewish survival is threatened, and that's a very effective lever. Now, come back to your point, Richard, in the long run, that may turn out to be not in the best interests of the American Jewish community, whether it's healthy for a community that styles itself a religious community to base itself simply on issues of survival and on the emotion of fear and the kind of sense of threat that's so pervasive in American Jewish life. That's a major question as to whether in the long term that's healthy. Just today I was reading an article by A.B. Yehoshua, a very prominent Israeli novelist, and he was talking about where this peace process might lead in terms of, he was talking about Israeli identity, but the same thing works for the American Jewish community, is what do you do if you no longer have an enemy? You remember the famous thing, was it Edward Shevardnadze who said that the Russians or the Soviets were going to do the worst thing that any country could do to any other country, is deprive you of your enemy, right? Well, it's at least possible, that Yasser Arafat is doing that to the Jews now. And if your whole sense of communal being is staked on a threat to your survival, what do you do if that threat no longer exists?
Well, on the other hand, I think certainly it's not the same threat to survival, but the Arab populations in Israel, Palestine, as well as throughout the Middle East, will continue to serve as a cultural other for Israelis, particularly for Israeli Jews. I don't think that situation will change, because even if we have in this final leg of the peace process an agreement that Palestinian state be established, it's a separate state from the Israeli state, and it's sort of like a marriage that's gone sour, the divorce, a separation situation. So there will certainly be some degree of geographical non-integration. I mean, there's even in the state of Israel, there are not, like the United States in many respects, there aren't that many integrated communities.
I think it's important to see if there is, and I think it's inevitable that there will be an independent Palestinian state. It's just a question of when. And I wouldn't want this show to go by without having a chance to say how tragic it is in my mind that since the independent Palestinian state is an inevitable outcome, and probably with its capital in Jerusalem, it's tragic that it's going to take so many years and so much more bloodshed to get to a point where we could be very soon with no real threat to the security of Israel. I mean, this whole thing about the military threat to the existence of Israel is so bogus in my mind, quite honestly, given the tremendous, immense military superiority that Israel has. But the point I want to make is that when we get to that point where there is an independent Palestinian state, the American Jewish community is still going to have a strong stake in perceiving it not only as other, but as threatening other. Because the American Jewish community has staked itself so strongly on some sense of threat. And I'm afraid that that's true even for the more dovish elements in the American Jewish community, those who support the peace process. The language is still the language of, we have to take the risk. But there's always the implication that there is a risk. There's always the implication that we are the ones at risk, we are the ones in danger, and yes, in the long run, we ought to take this risk, the liberals will say, those who support the Labor Party. But we've seen, again, in the last few weeks, what the Labor Party is willing to do in terms of military slaughter, and that is justified in terms of ongoing sense of threat. And that sense of threat is so basic to American Jewish life. And again, I just don't think it's healthy for the American Jewish community, but it's that sense of threat that leads the American Jewish community to pressure the American government so that we can have an American president clearly siding with the Israelis, even as the United Nations, at least, is preliminarily finding that the Israelis may very well have been intentionally killing civilians, and there's some evidence, unfortunately, the Israelis do that.
And the latest news today was that the Israeli government had formally protested the findings of the UN investigation.
Sure.
That they had intentionally shelled the...
I think the facts remain unclear, but we have an American president who's willing to publicly stand up and clearly take sides with Israel until it gets too morally uncomfortable, and then he sends his Secretary of State to become the peacemaker. But what I'm saying is that in part, not totally, but in part, of course, that's because the American Jewish community still brings that pressure to bear. Because those people in the American Jewish community who have the kind of moral sensitivity to realize that what Israel's doing is wrong, those people will not stand up publicly and generate enough political force. Now, some people do, but not enough to generate a strong enough political force to make the American government more even-handed. So...
it's part of this tribal defensiveness, I think, that there's not more civil courage within the American Jewish communities. I want to come back briefly to the idea that we still need the enemy. Remember, after Glasnost and Perestroika, suddenly Saddam Hussein, who seemed to have been a very significant ally for the United States, became our enemy per se. The epitome of the enemy, of the Feindbild, we say in German, the image of the enemy. I think that role will now be played not so much by Palestinians or by the PLO, but rather by the surrounding Arab states. Remember, The connection is made in the media between Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Syria and Iran and Iraq. Syria, Iran, and Iraq being states that are still classified by the United States as well as Libya as supporters of terrorism.
Well, it's clearly the Muslim fundamentalists who are cast in that role.
Right, and at least if you read the recent press editorials, New York Times, about at least about 2 weeks ago, things have changed a bit, about the leader of Syria, whose name I'm blanking on.
Assad.
Thank you. Hafez Assad is making, at least in terms of the peace process, significant mistakes. The Israelis, at least the Israeli political establishment, is profiting from his seeming unwillingness to be part of the peace process. So I think the role of enemy is still there, and I think it's being overtaken, perhaps, as you say, by the more fundamentalist Muslim elements of those Arab states.
Well, in wrapping things up, I want to return to this idea real quickly of tribal defensiveness, because it seems to me that if the leadership of the American Jewish community is so intimately connected with the political leadership in Israel, that democratic feelings or democratic expressions of feelings among American Jews may never be realized, because that their moral response to this crisis is always going to be muted by a leadership that is obliged to toe the Israeli line.
Yeah, but I wouldn't really put too much of the emphasis or the blame on the leadership. I think that there's still enough room for democratic change, and to some, in the American Jewish community, and to some extent we've seen it, as we were saying before, in the last 10 to 15 years, going back even to the invasion of Lebanon in '82. Things are changing. They change slowly, but they do change. And so while clearly the leadership is going to try to mute the calls for change, you see, because from the leadership's point of view, it's unity that's always the key point. Still, the ultimate responsibility comes back to the individual, right? And it comes back to whether individuals are willing to transcend their own ambivalence, to transcend their own conflicted feelings, and be willing to say, even if it makes me unpopular within the Jewish community, even if it goes against some gut feeling I have that all Jews ought to stick together, I can see clearly that by my moral standards, what Israel is doing is wrong, and I have an obligation as a Jew, as a citizen, to stand up and say that. And if enough people do that, I believe that things will change.
And there is some hope for that. Certainly I'm of the same view. But there is some hope for democracy in the American Jewish community, and so many people affiliate themselves Jewishly in the United States with communal organizations. There's always the joke that sometime in his lifetime every American Jew will have been the president of some Jewish organization or another. So there is reason for hope on that scale, but there still is this tension between wanting to look unified, and it's a tension that we see in other American ethnic minority groups. The best example recently, the Million Men March, the African American communities in the United States.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. This is Richard Curtis. You've been listening to Hemispheres. With me in the studio, I've been talking with Dr. Ira Chernus and Dr. David Brenner, professors at the University of Colorado. And coming up next, we have Corriente. We just have to get things playing here.